As you know, we all came together thanks to the Commerce Department and Acting Secretary Rebecca Blank, and we're going to hear from many of the leaders of the Commerce Department in this program, or several of them anyway. And last year, Congress asked the Commerce Department to prepare this report, as we just heard, and to create this board to give advice. I guess it's advice. I don't know, Mark, is this advice we're giving you, or what would you call it? But and so it's in that context, really, that we're here today. And we're really trying to focus today as much on the inequality question, not as a human rights question, but really as an economic issue. And one of the things that intrigued me about Abby, I should probably say this for the introduction, but is, as a leader at Goldman Sachs, she actually talked about this in our meetings as an economic issue, not just an issue of inequality, which is sort of an obvious problem in the country, in a democracy, the rising inequality that we face, but the effects that it's had on demand. So that's really, I guess, half of what we're all here to talk about today, and the other half is innovation. What is the role of public services? What is the government's role in encouraging innovation? In our own union's case, we've talked for, I guess, 5 years. Debbie Goldman actually has led this work, campaign called Speed Matters, about high-speed broadband and how genuine high-speed internet, is an economic stimulus, and the fact that in the U.S., we've been falling behind, really for 20 years in that regard, sort of trusting it all to the market. And again, since it's just the two of us here, Jason will show up, I think, but one of the things that's always intrigued me also about Abby is, everything, despite Goldman Sachs, everything is not markets. We need partnership. We need to understand, where sort of capitalism itself leaves off and where you need, the rest of us, the public sector, but also public policy debate to pick up. And the example of the Internet, I think, is a really good one in that regard because, you see the fall off of high-speed Internet in the U.S. over 20 years compared to other countries, and you also see the fact that in rural America particularly, there's not enough stimulus on the investment side. And so what do we do about that? If we don't look at public policy to fill those gaps, we're going to be back where we were, when there were telephones, only in urban America. And the last 80 years will repeat itself. So we'll look at some ways not only on that issue, but on other issues. How do we stimulate innovation that in turn stimulates the economy and gets this economy moving again? So let me start out with that chart and tell a couple of stories about these charts and how they fit together. So this one, lots of people have seen and written about, especially in the last year or so. So this is like the long run, post-World War II all the way up through today. And so the good news was a nice 30-year run where you saw, productivity, hourly compensation keep up with each other. And basically incomes in the U.S., the growth of what people call the U.S. middle class. And, at about that time, mid-'70s, people would talk about, productivity increases in the U.S. compared to other countries and that this was a growing problem. And then you see, the results of, sort of what's happened since then. So here it just looks like a productivity gap. But let's go to the next slide. And we see the share of total income going to the top 1% of households. This is a 100-year line. And you see that almost everything, people like me who, spent most of their life on social change, building, in my case, labor movement, we end up back where we were. This is like I don't know what I would call this for me, sort of like the Great Depression in a mental sense. That, here I am, sort of on my watch, and things are back where they were 100 years ago. This is pretty disturbing from where I come from. But it also, again, has gigantic economic implications because obviously that 1% can't spend, and if they did, what would it be on? In the same way, when you had the kind of income distributions that we had, and with wages keeping up with productivity in the post-war period up through the 70s. And then, obviously coming from labor, everybody wouldn't look at this as this next chart as the main factor. And it doesn't need to be the main factor, but we would argue this is an important factor, not so much union membership, which is how this is labeled, but really collective bargaining coverage. I would probably relabel this, even though it's my chart. Because the issue isn't union membership matters to unions, but actually the chart in the U.S. case is almost exactly the same when you look at collective bargaining coverage. And so what this really means is that when we look at 2010, 11.9%, and this includes the public sector. So the decline is much more severe if you take the public sector out, because at the beginning of this period, you didn't have public sector collective bargaining in the U.S., and public sector bargaining has actually gone up to the level that we see here in 1954. It's about 33%. Despite the attacks this year, it's now dropping, but it's about there. And in the private sector today, it's about 6.9%, and that's 80% of the economy. So that's actually where you see the more drastic implications of this. But again, I don't think it's important, except to those of us, in unions, what union membership is. But collective bargaining coverage is critical, because that means that the other 90-some% of the private sector are not at the table at all. They don't have any effective way to meet with their employers and talk about what's the deal going to be. And that's why you see the huge gap. It's among the primary reasons you see the huge gap between productivity and compensation, or the average hourly wage. If you put those charts on top of each other, again, we didn't do that. It's not the tradition, but it has a drastic effect. And then finally, we look at what's going on in the rest of the world in terms of, this is collective bargaining coverage. And so you see, for example, a country like France, where union membership is very low, but collective bargaining coverage is nearly universal. That's why I think that's a much more important number. France and the U.S. have similar union membership rates, but nearly universal bargaining coverage in France, public and private sector. And so you see that, and this is a snapshot, this chart, and the data is about 5 years old, but it hasn't changed. If anything, it's more severe now. And so you see a number of things that are interesting here, not only Europe and where the U.S. stands in relationship to Europe, but where the U.S. stands in relationship to Brazil or South Africa. And again, if we did each of these in a longitudinal graph, we would see that countries like South Africa and Brazil coming up from zero over a 25-year period. And so today in those countries, you get wage increases that are double-digit, still relatively low inflation, and you don't see that kind of gap between productivity increases and average hourly wages. So we would suggest that, number one, and I think the writers have done a good job of this in the report, noting the fact that just the growing disparity of income and also the gap between productivity and wages, again, not just as a human rights or democracy issue, but in terms of how does the U.S. compete with other nations. And similarly with collective bargaining coverage, we would say that that's a factor as well, and we're going to hear more about that from Richard and others. But the fact that in other countries, including Global South now, it's more and more typical to see bargaining coverage increase linked to democracy movements in those countries. This is true even in Tunisia, from this year, or Egypt, which is more of a 50-50 proposition where that's going to end up. But there's a linkage in those democracy movements between bargaining rights for workers, even in export zones. For example, in Egypt this year, we saw close to 1 million workers organize and demand not only their rights, but a higher standard of living. Whereas in the U.S., it's headed in the opposite direction. We would say it's unlikely that you're going to make up for this, again, in economic terms, the drop in demand, as much as, we support the president in most ways, by, a payroll tax cut for a year or then extending it a second year. The much bigger issue than the payroll tax, and again, that then robs Social Security of funds that it's going to need, and then we see others in the country turn around and say Social Security is underfunded. We would actually say that if workers had a voice in this country, this is, at all levels, and could negotiate as they do in Global South increasingly, as well as Europe and Canada, it would actually be a major factor in shifting that demand curve, in stimulating the economy, and we wouldn't have to resort to cutting taxes at a time that we need those dollars to deal with other economic issues. So with that, we're going to do questions, I think, at the end. And I'm going to shift into the introducing role here, although I already started to do it. And to me, the most important thing about Abby, and she does welcome this, is her willingness to be a bridge and a stimulator of conversation, in many, many forums. You do have her full bio. I'm not going to go through that. I know she won't care about that. But for years and years, she's been a key commentator on, where our equity market's going. That's sort of her day job, but she also is very, very involved in the community in many ways and very interested in education and serves as a leader in education on several boards. Is an economist by trade, did work originally, I think, at the Fed here in D.C., before going to Goldman and many other positions. But again, in our conversations, I think what's remarkable and almost unique is her willingness to sort of step outside of those institutional roles and talk from data and give us huge amounts of data if we want it. This is all of us, not just those of us on this committee, but the kind of data that we need to sort out in an objective way, where is it that we stand today and where is it that we might go. So with that, Abby, thanks again for being with us.
Larry, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I truly am very pleased to be here and to be part of what I think is going to be a very useful conversation. I look forward to hearing the comments from other people who will drill down with their own expertise in certain areas. I have a somewhat daunting role, and that is within just a few minutes to provide summary comments touching on any number of topics. And there are enough people in this room who have thought about the basic issues of innovation, competitiveness, what is going on with regard to income distribution and so on, that I am a little bit concerned that perhaps my comments will be viewed as too headline, too top level. Suffice to say that we have done a great deal of detailed work in this area. I'm just trying to set the stage in terms of some of the broad topics that we really should be sure to address today. Now, one of the things that I'd like to point out is that my role at Goldman Sachs is, as it has always been, in investment research. And one of the things that we have been doing in recent years is to step back and to use a different time horizon on some of the work that we're doing. So rather than worrying about what a particular economic data point might look like at 8:30 tomorrow morning and the impact it might have on the stock market tomorrow through next Tuesday, we have been devoting significant resources to taking a broader look, stepping back, thinking about the issues that will matter in the months and years ahead, and very often the most important thing I do is trying to identify the issues that corporate leaders, investment officials, and so on are not even thinking about now, and let them know that we think they will be important. And so, for example, we started to do work on climate change a decade ago, thinking that this was going to be a critical issue in terms of not just corporate liabilities, but something that could affect economic growth, could affect jobs, both good and bad, and of course could affect the competitiveness of the United States. Another issue that we began working on several years ago is the one that Larry mentioned, and I think will be critical to the conversation this afternoon, and that has to do with the slowdown and dare I say it, the decline that we're seeing in household incomes in the United States. Now, there are many different ways to define it. There's the arithmetic mean, there's the median, there's looking at it in various percentile forms and so on. But let me just give you 2 data points. Before the financial crisis and before the recession which followed it, in the preceding decade, what we know is that median household income, adjusted for inflation, fell about 4%. And we know that if we look a little bit lower down on percentile, so instead of the 50th percentile, the median, we look down to a level that used to be referred to as, shall we say, blue collar, the decline was actually more substantial. And so even before the financial crisis, something was amiss. We were seeing that the lion's share of American workers were not keeping pace with inflation. Now, I would say that the financial crisis in some ways unmasked the problems that were already there and unfortunately also exacerbated them. Well, what do I mean by unmasked? Many of the problems that were leading to this compression of income, particularly in the middle income levels, we were sort of offsetting. We had many young men going into the construction trades, which were paying pretty well for the time being. We had other families reducing their savings and making up the difference in their income by not saving as much or, unfortunately, in many cases, borrowing too much and so on. But what we now know, based upon some data that was released just within the last few days, is that the situation has been exacerbated. There is a report that was published, and I'll just hold up a copy of it so you have some idea of what it looks like, by Gordon Green and John Coder, that I would suggest that you take a look at, which is using data. Now, it's not the same scrub data similar to what I just referred to in terms of the 4% decline and so on. This is more current information, and so it's subject to revision, but it does appear that since the beginning of the financial crisis and the recession which followed, there has been a subsequent decline of high single digits, perhaps 8 or 9%. And what I found even more striking in their data is that there was a decline in median income of about 5%, even for families that were still working. So this, to us, I think, helps us understand the level of angst and anxiety. But let's keep in mind that the problems pre-existed and have been many years in duration. What about the Innovation Advisory Board? As Larry indicated, the IAB was created by an act of Congress, and what we have been mandated to do is to come forward with a report to the Congress in January 2012. And as this Innovation Advisory Board has sat down with Commerce Department officials and representatives from the White House, what's very clear is that there are an infinite number of issues that we might wish to address. But for purposes of my setting the stage, let me just talk about 3 different things. Now, first of all, the advisory board is talking about innovation, competitiveness, and as Larry indicated, what all this means for job creation, not just in terms of numbers of jobs, but also in terms of the quality of the jobs, the skills that people need to bring to bear, and, of course, how they will be paid. And so the question is, how are we doing? As a nation, how are we doing? And there are 2 ways to slice it. One is relative to others, and the other is relative to ourselves. So there's the domestic comparison. How are we doing relative to the United States of a decade or 2 or 3 ago? And then, of course, there's the discussion about the overall global context. With regard to how we are doing ourselves, the picture is not what we would like. I mentioned the median income numbers. What about the education numbers? For the first time, as far as we can tell, because the data here, again, are not necessarily consistent over the multi-year period, is it appears that educational attainment in the United States stopped growing 10 or 12 years ago. Now, there are many different ways to measure it: quality of primary school, quality of secondary school. What I'm looking at more specifically is the likelihood of a young adult having a 4-year college degree. Now, before I go any further, I know that a 4-year college degree is not necessarily the answer for everyone. And I know that for many people, it's much more important to get specific job skills, whether that's on the job, an associate degree, and so on. But just bear with me in terms of looking at the data for a 4-year college degree. A young adult in the United States today is no more likely to have a 4-year college degree than his or her counterpart was 10 or 12 years ago. It's the first time we have seen that. It is the first time that we have stagnated in this measurement. And, oh, by the way, it gets worse. Because if you are a young woman, you are today more likely to have a 4-year college degree than you would have been 10 or 12 years ago. And if you are a young man, you are therefore, by definition, less likely to have gotten the 4-year college degree. We believe that one of the contributing factors may very well have been that many young men were attracted into what proved to be the illusory opportunities in the construction trades, being paid a great deal until those jobs were no longer available. For the first time that we have seen it in the data, the unemployment rate for males is today higher than for females. Something that is pretty uncommon in U.S. data. So when we talk about how are we doing, again, 3 metrics. One is education. We're not doing so great. I'm going to come back to that point. The second one is research and development. It's not just what's happening in the private sector, but what's happening in the government sector. The last panel today will be talking about the role of the public sector in research and development. I'll spend a few moments talking about private sector. And then the third piece is infrastructure. After the Second World War, there was the general acknowledgement that there was a role for the federal government in particular and government in general to provide the infrastructure we needed as a nation to move forward. Typically think of it as transportation, be it for freight or for people. We did it. The interstate railway system, the investments previously on railroads and so on. And today we think that infrastructure is undoubtedly in the context of broadband. We have no doubt about it. For those who are interested, we published a paper more than a year ago in which we talk about the new geography of innovation. We've done a comparison in here of the innovative things in the United States versus what's going on across the globe. I'm very happy to share this with you. Just send me your email or we'll figure out some way to do it, and we'll send you copies of it. And so, again, we have to break our discussion. Number one, how are we doing? And number two, how are we doing relative to the rest of the world? And I'll state something baldly and boldly. We are still the most innovative nation on the planet. And our workers are still the most productive. But what has changed dramatically over the last decade or so in particular is that gap. We now see that the leadership position we had is being challenged in several different areas. Let me give you one. We talked about education before. We're not doing as good a job as we had done previously of making sure that each generation was better educated than the one before. This is happening at the same time that other nations has part of their own public policy the goal of enhancing education in their countries. The United States, for generations, was always number one in terms of percentage of population with a college degree. We no longer are. And depending upon which data set you use, we're either number 8 or number 12, but in any case, we're not number 1 anymore. And this is disturbing. The other thing that's disturbing is that other nations have made a conscious effort to educate their young people in the topics that will help spur innovation. Now, the acronym of the year, I know it's the acronym because the President now uses it, is STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and math. It's those important subjects which are so critical to how we do in terms of technological innovation. The percentage of our college students who are focusing in on STEM is about 1/3 what it was a generation ago. And that's just looking at the majors. I'm not even talking about the fact that we have people today who are graduating from fairly good colleges who really aren't numerate, who really don't have much in the way of scientific literacy either. And that, to me, is very disturbing. By the way, if you look at the same numbers for Asia, they are 2.5 times more likely to be a STEM major than is the case in the United States. The first topic was education. The second topic, R&D. How are we doing relative to ourselves? How are we doing relative to other countries? Well, relative to other countries, we are still somewhat better, but we're not what we used to be. Okay, so R&D in the United States as a percentage of GDP is currently running about 2.5%. In the rest of the G7, it's about 2.1. I guess that's a significant difference, but if you think back to periods that preceded enormous gains in aggregate productivity and enormous steps up in terms of middle income earning and standard of living, these numbers do not compare and is something that we really need to work on. The other thing that we see is a shift in terms of things like patents. Here's a little quiz for the people in the room. Of the patents issued by the United States of America, what percentage of them go to American citizens or American entities? Well, there's a ringer in the front row who knows the answer, so that doesn't count. About 50%. Okay, so think about that for a moment. Who are getting the other patents? About 13% of U.S. patents go to Europeans, 21% to Japanese, primarily the very large Japanese electronic and auto companies, and 10% of American patents go to China and the rest of the world. The rest of Asia. And so when we think about this, what we have to recognize is that there's a shifting balance of economic growth and therefore economic power in the United States. Let me give you some numbers that I hope will make you think about this changing balance. The United States is the world's single largest economy, measured in terms of GDP. Europe, if you put it all together, is about the same size. And let's think about, over the last decade, which nations have contributed the most to incremental GDP. So that would be a function of how big are you to start, the size of your GDP, times the growth rate. So you would think that the United States and Europe should be contributing about the same amount, right? Because we're the same size. Turns out the U.S. was growing notably faster than Europe during this period of time. So the United States contributed about 25% of the increase in global GDP over the last decade, and Europe, depending upon how you want to count it, 8 to 10%. Shifting economic balance. So who took up the slack? Basically, the emerging nations of China, Brazil, India, the so-called BRIC nations, with much of that coming from China. And so when we take a look at this changing balance, that's something that I think also needs to be part of our discussion, because there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that has to do with the role of U.S. corporations. U.S. corporations have typically funded significant amounts of research and development in the United States. Usually between 65 and 70% of all R&D spending does come from U.S. corporations. And we have a very interesting situation right now. And again, here I'm referring to another report we published, and happy to send copies of this to all of you as well. When we take a look at the large companies in the United States, the so-called S&P 500. Now, there are economists in this room. What is the percentage of overall GDP that's related to foreign trade? 15%, 18%, something like that? Sorry?
1 to 3%.
I'm sorry?
Point of view.
That was
1 to 3.
1 to 3. If I'm talking about looking at the import-export numbers as a percentage of GDP, but it's depending upon the quarter, usually about 15%, sometimes a little bit higher. For the companies in the S&P 500, they currently generate 30%, not of their profits, 30% of their sales outside the United States. So this is a reflection of where business is happening, right? This is not a question, again, of their profits. This is their revenues, 30% coming from outside the United States. So when we talk about companies having significant balance sheets, and Larry's data pointed out that profits have been doing quite well at a time when income growth has not, we know, for example, that corporate balance sheets are robust. We also did a calculation, which you'll find in here, that shows that U.S. companies who are doing so much business now outside the United States have more than $1 trillion in assets outside the U.S. Using this terminology, these are unrepatriated foreign earnings. Okay, unrepatriated, we haven't brought them back, 1.2 trillion. And one of the reasons they don't get brought back is because there's a different tax rate. If you leave them, let's say you have a factory in France, you make the money in France. If you leave it in France, you're not paying U.S. taxes on it. If you bring it back to the United States, there's a very significant hit, if you will, from a tax standpoint. So I'm not suggesting policy here at all. I'm just pointing out that there is money sitting outside the United States, which, if we could find a way to encourage to bring it back, might be more useful in terms of helping build the infrastructure here and also in terms of doing the direct investment here. And again, I don't want to argue policy at all, other than to say that the last time we tried this, it didn't work very well. Okay, the last time we tried it, we had a so-called tax holiday, and what many companies did is they brought the money back, but they didn't use it to help the economy grow. They used it for other purposes because money is fungible, right? You bring money from France, you don't really care where it's going. So there are some suggestions that have been made that, okay, if we have another tax holiday or we lower the taxes again, when this money does become repatriated, it can only benefit from the lower tax rate if you can show in some manner that it was used to support investment here, to hire workers here, and so on. So it's a tough thing to actually measure and benchmark, but it's among the things that are being discussed. So I know that our next speaker is here, so I don't want to go on too much longer, other than to say that this is a series of long-term issues that have been unfortunately measured in decades, where we have not necessarily done what we needed to do. And what we are hopeful for is that by identifying the sources of the concerns, we can put in place good policy, not just for the public sector, but also for the private sector, so that we can move forward. And I will stop there.
Great. So we will have questions in a few minutes, but now, Jason, we want to welcome you up here, Jason Furman. And that you leave the easy chair, you come to the hard chair now. Nothing's too hard for Jason, so great to see you.
Larry, how are you? Good.
Yeah, welcome.
Good to see you.
So again, there are bios of folks here. I'm not going to go through Jason's lengthy bio, except to remind us all, he is the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy, and he's the Principal Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. He's done, I think, almost 20 years of economics and what I'd call public policy, right, stretching back to the Clinton years. I got to know Jason a bit on the healthcare conversations that we had into the night with Terrell, who's not going to be here. But and I can say this, that he, from my point of view, similar to what I said about Abby, he is sort of wide open to looking at data to answer problems. I found that, you know, refreshing. Others found that others had other views of them. But I think that's what's key here in the time we're in. It's like, how do we learn from what we see around us rather than, you know, the preconceived notions that we have. I've spent a lot of time with Jason. Another of his issues that he oversees is telecom policy and other, you know, internet policy. And he's been terrific to work with. So with that, Jason, again, your bio is out there. I'm not going through the Harvard and all the rest of it. So welcome here, and look forward to listening to you.
Well, thank you, Larry. Thanks for inviting me. And thanks to both you and Abby for serving on the advisory board. You're certainly not paid commensurate with the important services you're rendering to the government.
Zero doesn't count.
And the country.
Buying your own lunch at the events, that doesn't count.
And I think it's great, Larry, that you, together with the Kella Manovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, and Dean and the Center for Economic Policy Research organized this to help really build on that and get more input for poor Mark, who actually has to write the report, and I don't think got any extra money for writing it, although he is paid.
Yeah, he's doing great.
The other thing I want to say is people sometimes ask me what the National Economic Council is and what it does. And if you read all of the laws ever passed by Congress, you would come to the conclusion that we actually have only one responsibility, and that is consulting on this innovation and competitiveness report, which is assigned to us in the statute, the only place the National Economic Council appears in statute.
Perfect.
So, Larry, I saw your charts. Abby heard a lot of your remarks and think I very much agree with all of them, so I'll try not to repeat, but just synthesize what I think are four very important facts about inequality, and then go through three important policy implications and what it is we're trying to do about it. Before that, I want to say today the administration's focus is very much on the American Jobs Act. It is coming for a vote in the Senate. We're very hopeful that it passes. Independent forecasters have said it would create up to 1.9 million jobs. And what's notable is in Washington there's often a debate between different ideas. So on the budget, there was a debate between the president's concept about a balanced way to bring the deficit down and Chairman Ryan, who had a different approach, but one that would have brought the deficit down. On jobs, there really isn't a debate right now. There's the president's plan, and most of those who are opposing it in the Senate don't have their own plan for jobs, don't have an alternative, don't have anything that they could hand to an independent forecaster who would say, like they've said for our plan, that it would create up to 1.9 million jobs. So we would really much like to have a debate, like to have something that's pushing that debate forward. Today is just the beginning of it in the Senate. Regardless of what happens in the vote, we're going to be, the administration of the president, continuing to push forward. That's of the moment and of the day, but wanted to step back, but then it will come back to jobs in the end. In terms of four factual statements about jobs, the first, and this is covered in Larry's slides and was covered in Abby's comments, is inequality has been a decades-long process. It manifests itself in a lot of ways, a disconnect between productivity growth and income growth, an enormous concentration of income and wealth at the top, and perhaps the reason we find it most troubling is it manifests itself in stagnant or declining incomes for the middle class. Were it not for the economic crisis that began in 2008, President Obama would have inherited and have to deal with the economic, frankly, crisis that had gone on for decades before that, including the fact that the economic expansion in the 2000s was perfectly respectable when it came to GDP growth, decent, not spectacular, but was absolutely terrible when it came to household incomes, the first expansion on record in which those incomes fell. And that was just the most extreme manifestation of this decades-long trend in inequality. There's a lot of causes to that decades-long trend. Traditionally, the economics literature had emphasized skill-biased technological change, so the idea that innovations could increase the reward to more highly skilled people, driving up inequality. Larry Katz and Claudia Golden have emphasized that there are really two halves to that equation. It's not just what the demand for skills is, but also what the supply of skills is. And they've pointed out that the cohorts born in 1875 to 1950, every decade added about a year to average educational attainment. That slowed by about 2/3 in the decades that followed. So at the same time that there's this increased demand for skilled jobs, there's a smaller supply of workers to fill them. There's no doubt that institutional factors have also played an important role in the rise of inequality. And you see this, Larry sees it and experiences it every day, so I don't think he needs academic sites, but everything from Richard's sitting in the front row's work to historical work by Frank Levy and Peter Temin to research by labor economists like David Card have showed that explaining both the time pattern of inequality in the United States and explaining the pattern of inequality across countries, the decline in labor unions in the United States is a very important part of that, together with changes in culture about compensation, changes in the minimum wage, and other institutional factors. So that's the first fact, decade-long trend, lots of different causes for it, manifests itself in declines in middle-class incomes. The second fact is that inequality is especially pronounced at the top, and the closer you zoom in on the top, the more you see it. And some of the most remarkable data are the IRS every year publishes the income for the top 400 Americans. That's a group now that you need an adjusted gross income of $110 million or higher to be a part of. Adjusted gross income probably understates the income because, for example, unrealized capital gains don't show up on your tax form, don't show up in those data or really in any other data. That's a group that in 2008 had 1.3% of the income, and that's 0.0000 something or other of the population. That's more than twice the share of income it had in 1992. And one of the things that those data let you see is it's not just these forces I was talking about before, whether it's technology, supply of labor, institutional factors that are shaping the pre-tax distribution of income, but at the same time the tax system, rather than leaning against the wind, has actually been leaning into it and exacerbating it. So this is a group that faced an average tax rate of 29.9% in 1995. It now faces an average tax rate of 18.1% in 2008. That is well below the average tax rate, especially if you include payroll taxes, faced by a lot of middle-class families, a point that I will come back to in the more normative part of this discussion. So that's the second fact, is that inequality is very pronounced at the very top, and that inequality has been exacerbated by changes in the tax system, again, especially at the very top. The third is I want to look is zooming in more closely on the last couple of years and saying about them, first of all, the most severe form of inequality is joblessness. When 14 million people are unemployed, when a larger number of people are discouraged workers looking for jobs, that's the worst manifestation of inequality. You don't need any data to tell you that, but certainly that an article that Robert Pear wrote in the New York Times yesterday, drawing on some recent research, and I haven't been able to fully evaluate this, so I repeat it with caveats, although it matches other data we know, is that if you look at incomes as a whole, they fell by 7%. Since the recovery began. For the unemployed, they've fallen by 18%, and for those who are employed, they've fallen by much less than that 7% average. Again, I don't know if those exact numbers are right, but obviously Oh, they are right. Okay, I'm told they're right. But I won't believe they're right until Mark Dahms, who I don't see anymore,
He's standing in the doorway.
Tells me that they are. But certainly that confirms the pattern. So part of what you want to do about inequality is most immediately to do something about jobs, and that doesn't just affect the data tomorrow that someone goes from 0 in labor earnings to some positive number in labor earnings. It affects their ability to be employed, to contribute meaningfully, to have rising wages and a successful career trajectory for years to come. So you're not just it's not just inequality today that's affected by joblessness, but even after people eventually return to the workforce, the longer they've been out of it, the lower their average lifetime wages will be after it. So conversely, the more you can do about it now, the more you can reduce future inequality. And then finally, the last positive factual point is that inequality can negatively impact growth, and it can negatively impact democracy. In terms of growth, there's a long debate in the development economics literature about whether inequality is good or not good. And the argument on the good side, and I'm not saying that this has ever been right, but the argument on the good side is that high-income people save more. That means a country can accumulate more capital, and by accumulating more capital, it can grow more quickly and become rich. There's a chance that someplace, sometime, somehow, that's been true. There's no chance that that's true in the United States today. What makes us prosper is not the ability for us to accumulate capital more quickly. That's very important, and that's an important part of growth. We also have a global capital market that we have access to. What really drives America forward is innovation and ideas. And there's no question that inequality subtracts from innovation, and it subtracts from ideas, because it takes a portion of our society that would be able to be the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates, and contribute, invent, develop, become entrepreneurs, and puts obstacles in their way, makes it harder for them to do it, and thus takes away from total factor productivity growth, which for an advanced economy like the United States is the only way. We can't take and adapt other people's ideas nearly as much as we can drive the frontier of knowledge and innovation forward, and that's something we need to be able to draw on all of our people for. Inequality also can negatively impact democracy in terms of speech, participation, and it's something that Alan Greenspan said, that it wasn't clear how long democratic capitalism could survive a large increase in inequality. So those are 4 important points: a decades-long trend for inequality, particularly pronounced at the top, with the tax system contributing to it rather than fighting against it. That recently it's gotten worse, and it's gotten worse in large part because of unemployment and joblessness, although you do see it in wages as well. And then finally, that especially for a country like the United States, you would expect inequality to have a negative impact on growth and democracy. So what can we do about all of that? I think there's 3 very important broad lessons, and I think they very much guide what was the president's agenda on the campaign trail before it became so focused on the short-run economic crisis, and guide the efforts to get out of the crisis as well. The first pretty much follows almost directly from the factual, which is that we need to be very focused on jobs today. And anything we can do to create jobs, whether it is investments in infrastructure that creates jobs, or a payroll tax cut for small businesses that encourages them to hire people, or a tax incentive to hire veterans, or something to prevent teachers from being laid off, any of these will reduce inequality today, will help keep people in the labor force, integrate them in the labor force, and have higher wages in the future. And that's why the president is so focused on the immediate pressing nature of the American Jobs Act. The second, in terms of some lessons for policy you can draw from this, is we can't and shouldn't do something about every cause of inequality, but we can and should do something about anything where we can, and where we can't, then we should offset it in other ways. So to the degree you think technology has played a role in inequality, I don't think anyone would advocate that you want less technology, less innovation, less growth. So leave that aside. On the other hand, to the degree you think slowing, and this is something Abby covered at great length and depth, anyone thinks that slowing college enrollment is playing a role in inequality, that's absolutely something we can and should do something about. Anyone who thinks that decline in unionization, in part due to a regulatory and legal climate that have interfered with that for a long time now, that is something we can and should do something about. Same thing with minimum wage and other factors that have been causing inequality. To the degree you can't, then the most important thing is to not make inequality worse, and maybe even to try to make it a little bit better. And that's where something like letting the tax cuts for high-income households expire goes, and that's where something like the President's call for tax reform, which is founded on a number of different principles: lowering rates, cutting tax expenditures, cutting the deficit, increasing growth. And the last one, which has gotten justifiably a lot of attention, is the Buffett rule, which says that no one making over $1 million a year should pay a lower tax rate than middle-class families. Certainly that top 400 paying 18% probably apply to a lot of folks in that bracket. Over $1 million wouldn't apply to everyone. In fact, there are many people who are paying close to the statutory marginal rate. The Buffett rule isn't focused on that. It's focused on, for example, the 22,000 people who make over $1 million a year who pay a tax rate of less than 15% a year. And part of why you care about that is you don't want a tax system that is exacerbating inequality, especially considering no matter what we do, we can do a lot to combat pre-tax inequality. There'll be certain forces that are probably still propelling inequality forward, which is why it's especially important not to be exacerbating it. So that's the second lesson. You can't do something about all of inequality. You can do something about some of its causes, and if you can't, you can try to offset it in other ways. By the way, the other important one I'd add there is healthcare. The rising cost of healthcare is one of the important factors in wage or income inequality, and helping to bend the curve on the cost of healthcare is one of the important factors in dealing with that going forward. Now, in terms of the third positive lesson is, I think all of this, and Abby spoke quite well to this as well, is a reminder that innovation can expand opportunities. And to some degree, that's innovation that's designed to expand those opportunities. If you look at something like the President's Green Jobs agenda, that's very much about creating new types of jobs, good middle-class jobs. Investments in infrastructure would fall under that heading. If you look at something that Larry and I have worked on in terms of the President's National Wireless Initiative, it's not just about creating jobs, it's also about, for example, expanding broadband to rural areas, which can help deal with another form and pattern of inequality. And then innovation, in addition to creating middle-class jobs, helping to empower people economically and politically, can also just help increase the tide for everyone. It can increase economic growth, and the faster you're growing, the more likely it is that the middle class is going to be seeing its incomes rising rather than its incomes falling. The more likely we're going to see the millions of jobs created that we're going to need to see created to dig us out of this hole and keep up with what continues to be a growing population. So with that, just want to say thanks again for doing this. I think your work is very important. We're very motivated and focused on the Innovation and Competitiveness report that Commerce Department is drafting, and look forward to seeing all of these themes you're discussing today in that.
Thanks, Jason. We have time for a few questions?
Yes,
okay, great.
So we'll take about 10 minutes worth of questions. So we've got a mic up here, and if you could please say your name and affiliation, that would be great.
Can I start?
You
Hi,
may.
can you hear me? My name is Sam. I'm a returned Boren Fellow with the National Security Education Program from Egypt.